Hello and welcome to Sips and Substance, where we distill politics down to its essence. I'm Justin. We have Jonathan over here.
Well,
And this week we're going to focus on executive orders. But before we do, I want to see what Jonathan's drinking today because we definitely need to have a drink now.
and conveniently enough, this is sort of a coincidence because we made chili for football, and so I had Mexican lager with it, and it coincidentally kind of goes along with the theme of some of Trump's executive orders. I figured it'd be a good time to have a Mexican lager before some idiot accidentally slaps a tariff on it because it says Mexican on it. In any case, this is a Mexican lager from Ska Brewing, which is from Southwest Colorado. They do distribute a bit, so you might be able to find it where you are. Theirs is really solid. It's a little more earthy. Some of them are kind of sweet from the corn and such they put in there, but this one is not, and it's got a very earthy kind of finish to it. I really like this, really balanced beer. Goes really well with hot food.
All right, so before we talk about executive orders, I just want to real quick mention how difficult it is to cover Trump. He talks a lot of shit. It causes people to freak out, and oftentimes it's over nothing, right? At the same time, though, every time he does something abhorrent and unprecedented, he told us he was going to do it,
Yep.
right? And so we're in this situation where we have to analyze what he says and basically guess, is he going to do it? Is he not going to do it?
Yeah, I think that's you really brought up the major point there is like he's going to tell us when he's going to do something ridiculous, but he's also going to tell us when he has no intention of doing it. So we've got to kind of figure out, you got to kind of pay attention to it all just in case, but then sort of shift gear, don't overreact until he does something, right? He's trolling us with some of these things. We don't want to react. You don't want to feed the troll. So don't run around saying the sky is falling for everything. Save that for when he actually does the ridiculous things.
Right. And so I think one of the first ridiculous actions he did was he pardoned all the January 6 people, including the people who assaulted cops on video and also commuted the sentences for people who committed seditious conspiracy, which in colloquial terms is treason.
More or less, yeah.
And Biden also had some horrific pardons. We discussed this about a month ago where we didn't support the Hunter Biden pardon. And Biden made it even worse by giving preemptive pardons to a lot of government officials who didn't need them, frankly.
And his family.
Right. And it's just corruption. And, I don't think our positions have changed where we need pardon reform and we're not going to get it anytime soon, but the people should demand this, some sort of accountability for presidential pardons.
I agree with you, but unfortunately, generally, people demand accountability for presidential pardons for the other party.
Right.
But Republicans aren't crying for reform to the pardon right now, and Democrats weren't crying for it last month. So it's tough because it'll require a constitutional amendment, and that doesn't really look, unfortunately, in the cards, as you're saying, anytime soon. Doesn't mean we shouldn't. Doesn't mean we shouldn't keep reminding people that we do. Just means we're probably going to have to, our best bet is to vote for people that won't do this.
Right. And so what does that signal send, right? By pardoning violent people who did violence in your name, right? I think this is where we start getting to this, I don't want to say sky is falling, but it is similar to this 1984 dystopian world that we live in.
Yes. Well, I got a little rundown I want to give in a minute about how all that works. But the main reaction that I see as a problem here is that all these people were just told, you can do whatever the hell you want as long as it's in my name. I got your back. You can go beat the crap out of police officers. You can prompt a few of them to kill themselves. You can storm Congress. You can look for Nancy Pelosi and hope to kill her if you find her. It's good. We don't have a problem with that. And if you think that these groups and people are going to think, well, you know what? That was close, but we got out of it. We better not do that again. I think you're vastly misreading human nature and what's likely to happen from this.
Yeah. The QAnon shaman, while he wasn't, I think he was unfairly targeted in the sense that he was like some weird face to January 6th, whereas there were much more violent people, but he didn't have any contrition. He said he was going to buy more guns. I mean, like,
that's what we need.
Yeah. At the end of the day, like, I think there's one person out of everyone who said, no, I did something wrong.
Yes, some woman said, I'm suing to not take this pardon because I deserve to be punished.
Right. And it's like, you know what? We should elevate her because, frankly, she's doing the right thing. But a lot of these people, they're not sorry for what they did. And that's fundamentally the problem.
And they'll do it again.
Yeah.
Hopefully we won't have to talk about it too much, but if we have to talk a lot about a potential Trump third term, here's his shock troops, right? They have no trouble. They've demonstrated they have no trouble being violent. And when you tell them there's no consequences for you if I'm in power, I don't see what's going to stop them from being violent again.
Yeah. So again, to go back to the theme, recognize what's happening, but don't freak out, but be ready.
Along those lines, I wanted to talk about before I do that, you wanted to talk about the difference between memoranda and
right. Yeah. So similar to executive orders, there have been some questionable memoranda. So the DHS rescinded a memo about doing raids at sensitive areas. So now they're going to allow immigration raids at churches, hospitals, funerals, schools, etc.
Being an educator, I can give firsthand evidence that schools are sending out, hey, this is what you should do if immigration officials come to our school, right? And basically who to refer them to and whatnot. It's weird. They're not saying don't cooperate, but they're saying we have people here that know what to do and know the extent of the law. Send them to them. And so, I teach college online, so it's not going to be a thing for me. If it is, if people come into my classroom while I'm online with them, there really won't be much I can do. But my wife at her school, right, they have a policy. You can't just walk in. You have to go to the front desk for security reasons. And so if you see people, make sure they go to the front desk, and then they'll be coming down with school officials or whatever. And there's just a defined procedure. And for teachers to have to add that to all the crap they have to deal with on a regular basis it's a bit much.
Right. And the whole purpose of this is shock and awe, right?
Yep.
They want to have a message. They want to have their media spectacle to make it seem like they are doing something. And you can see how they're just blasting the deportation numbers right now. And it's like, you're not deporting more people than Biden did over the past year. So, but you're just advertising it to make it seem like you're doing something. And that's the whole point, right?
Yep.
And then the last memoranda I want to cover is this HHS memo that halted all external communication. And so that includes CDC guidance, National Institutes of Health, grant communication. And so there are people in clinical trials right now, and those trials have stopped because of this memo. And, hopefully this is honestly a temporary thing where everyone's trying to get their ducks in a row, because the other side of it is it would be batshit insane to have this just be like RFK signaling and we're ready to go with this Maha stuff.
Would you be surprised if that was actually?
No, I wouldn't be surprised at all, but it would be catastrophic.
Yes, that's what I expect they're trying to do. And that's why I'm going to get back on my high horse probably next week when RFK is being confirmed or going through confirmation hearings. Hopefully that'll be the extent of it, about the threat he can pose to the country.
But yeah, if you know anyone in the health academia or health sciences world right now, you've probably heard about this. Mm-hmm. And they are very concerned and nervous right now.
Yep. So the last thing I wanted to do today, at least for my part, is go back to what you said about sort of the weird sort of syncing up with 1984. And those of you that haven't read the book 1984 by George Orwell, you should stop right now and go buy it and read it. It not just because it's applicable to the times, it's a really good book, and it comes up a lot. But briefly, as we said, it's ridiculous to think the sky is falling. Oh my God, everything is going to hell. But it's also kind of ridiculous not to pay attention, because as you said, Trump tells us when he's going to do ridiculous things. It's just figuring out which ones he means and which ones he doesn't is a problem. But if you're a fan of Orwell in 1984, you're probably familiar with the famous line, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. And somebody in the Trump administration at least believes in that sentiment, because they're going out of their way to tell you what you saw on January 6th wasn't really what you saw. It was a peaceful day. All these people didn't do anything wrong. We're going to pardon them, right? The 2020 election, they're still relitigating. You have to be at least a nominal believer in the 2020 stolen election thing to get in any kind of position in government, right? And you also have to be all in for the new Biden investigations, right? They want to investigate the Biden administration while they say they're de-weaponizing the use of government, right? So they're changing the past. They already have, and they're continuing to do it by pardoning all these people. And now they're trying to control the future based on what happened in the past. And it's bizarre how much it lines up with the general approach in 1984. Beyond that, party loyalty, obviously the most important qualification for any government position, right? In case you were worried that there wasn't any sort of enough government surveillance to qualify as a 1984 world, the government is ordering government employees to spy on each other about if they covertly continue DEI programs, which is just beyond ridiculous to think about, right? You think about all the things people do covertly in the years to resist keeping up DEI programs, probably far down the list. They're stirring up foreign adventure to distract the population, right? Greenland, Panama, tariffs, all this good stuff. A lot of it is probably crap and it's never going to happen, but it's a distraction. And he's trying to distract you with it. And in some ways it's working, right? And then in case we're not mad enough already, he's focusing on the other even more to gin up more hatred, right? That's what the whole immigration crackdown is. It's not that, the economy is going to take off if we get rid of illegal immigrants. It's not. The economy is going to suffer if we do this, right? But it makes people hate the other guy. And when you can be hating somebody together, it's some sort of unity, and Trump is really good at taking advantage of that. And just a bonus for all of you that really like Orwell and the etymology of newspeak, which is the language he invented. We've got new terms from Trump. We have J6 is a term now. Invasion does not mean what it usually means under Trump. And then the swamp is something he likes to get to all the time. So it's just, I have always been a fan of Orwell. So these things resonate with me a lot. But when I see this, I'm like, I can't help but think this is just not a good development. But let's, again, not overreact, because hopefully a lot of the crap he's talking about, he's just saying for effect to try to troll us. But again, he tells us everything he's going to do. So we need to at least watch and paying attention, if nothing else. Okay, so what we want to do now is talk a lot about executive orders. If you've been paying attention to the news at all, you can't help but be inundated by all the executive orders that Trump has been rolling out in the first week, including, I think it was 22 on the first day. He's kind of set a record for first day executive orders. He had a big event. He's tossing out Sharpies to the crowd, as he likes to do. And say what you want about Trump, right? He's very good at putting on a show. He knows what his people like to see, and he did it with his executive orders, which is kind of interesting because it ties into, I think, what we're going to talk about for a lot of these executive orders is a lot of them are for show. And having a big show to put them out kind of makes a lot of sense from that perspective.
Yeah. So what is an executive order, right? I think if you follow politics, executive orders tend to be, well, if the president that you didn't vote for does something and you don't like it, well, that's a bad executive order. But, we're going to try and be fair here. And basically, an executive order is you're prioritizing law enforcement, right? The executive branch, they're the ones who enforce the law. And you're generally just rearranging the bureaucracy to some extent to get a certain policy outcome that you want. And you're doing it through the agency.
I think actually we can even simplify it even a little bit further, just for people that don't pay that close attention to executive orders. Executive order is just basically the president saying, I want to do this, right? He's testing the limits of his power. Generally, when the president wants to do something, Congress gives him permission to do it. That's when we pass a law. That's our normal business. This is the president saying, you know what? There's no law that really covers this, but this is what I want to do. And that leads to all the stuff that we're going to talk about next is like, how much authority does the president have to do this? How much will the courts or other aspects of the government push back? And how much of it is all about the show anyway?
Right. So as you said, you can't just make a law out of thin air. The presidents are always going to test the boundaries of this power. So as we know from the last administration, Joe Biden tried to have debt forgiveness, student loan debt forgiveness. And the courts struck that down and said, you don't have that power. that has to go through Congress. Trump, when he tried to have his so-called Muslim ban, he was struck down multiple times. And I think it was the third attempt when the Supreme Court said, okay, yes, you finally got it right. Good job. And you have broad authority to deal with national security issues. Now, I think we should also look at what's a good example of an executive order, right? Because that's what we want to do. We don't want presidents pushing the limits of their power. So I looked this up, and one thing that the Clinton administration did was they looked at the Civil Rights Act and they said, well, you can't discriminate based on national origin. And so he told every government agency that they need to have some system to assist people with limited English proficiency. And it was really non-controversial. Great.
I think another one we could talk about, which would be sort of ironic for this week, is that when LBJ put out an executive order saying that we shouldn't discriminate in hiring for the federal government. And lo and behold, Trump rescinded that one this week. So it's been in effect for 60 years. Nobody thought there was any problem with it. Everybody thought, hey, this is a pretty good executive order. But now you don't have to avoid discrimination if you're hiring for the federal government, which is interesting to see what the courts will do with that one.
Yeah, that'll be interesting because at the end of the day, you still have the Civil Rights Act, right? That's the law of the land.
Yep.
So, how can we categorize Trump's executive orders? I think you hit the nail on the head where a lot of this is just messaging, right? He's putting on a show. He wants to demonstrate to his voters that I am in charge and I'm getting shit done. But I think if you start peeling the layers off this onion, you'll see that a lot of them don't have teeth, but some of them do, right? And so we're going to have to really rely on the media to tell us what's actually at stake here and what's just noise that you should just completely ignore.
Well, I think also, as people that like to consume political stuff, anybody along those lines, do some reading yourself. You don't have to rely so much on the media to interpret these things for you, right? The good news sources are going to publish what's going on. Give it some thought in terms of interpretation. Don't rely strictly on the analysis from these media organizations, and especially look for multiple views. Right? Don't get caught up on this is my news source. This is what they think of it. This is what I think of it. It's one thing I always preach in class. In class, find somebody you disagree with and read what they have to say too, because stuff like that will be useful here. But definitely, as you're saying, pay attention to what the media is giving us, and then make some judgments.
Right. So in the show notes, we linked a Lawfare, I don't know if you can call it an article, but it's a list of all his executive orders. So you can click through them. You can actually read the orders. They're fairly short. And you can kind of get an idea of like, oh, yeah, that really isn't doing anything. Or, oh, you're directing this person to do what? That could be dangerous. So let's start talking about some of these. As you said before, the messaging, Trump said, we're going to be out of the Paris Climate Accords and we're leaving the World Health Organization. That's just messaging. It's going to have some effect, of course. Trump is allowed to do that, but it's mainly a messaging executive order. Some of these are clearly transactional. So we had 2 AI-related executive orders plus a crypto one. That's kind of interesting from like a day one executive order. Typically, you want to just hit like your number one campaign issues. So I thought it was interesting that he put the AI and crypto stuff in there because it clearly shows that all these tech oligarchs, if you want to call them that, they definitely have his ear and they are going to get policy outcomes that they want. And then another one is the TikTok ban non-enforcement. That, in my opinion, is definitely transactional. We discussed this a couple weeks ago, and since then, SCOTUS ruled that the ban is constitutional, 9-0. So all 3 branches of government agree that the TikTok ban is kosher. But now the president's not going to enforce it. Why? Because Trump had a mega donor who said, no, I want to keep the app. And, I don't think this EO is going to hold up to scrutiny in the courts, but at the same time, I don't know who's going to be able to sue.
That was a discussion we had earlier, right? Who's going to want to sue? The Congress would have standing. The Treasury Department would probably have some standing. Other states could sue, but it's hard to see who has damage, who's taking damages here other than Congress and the government,
The
right?
Constitution, right? The Constitution can't
But the
sue.
Constitution can't sue, right? You have to have some sort of standing, and we talked about that before with any number of issues. You have to be suffering some damage from this to happen. And the people that are suffering damage are like, oh, he's our president now. And even the Democrats are like, oh, yes, we want TikTok because they don't have any sort of backbone to stand up to the TikTok users either, apparently.
Right.
So this is a really weird executive order that seems on its face to be completely unconstitutional. The president can't just say, I'm not going to enforce the law. But unless somebody with standing sues, that's what's going to happen. Nobody's going to complain. The court's not going to jump in and have a ruling on its own. They can only reply to a case. So this will be interesting to follow to see if anybody does object in a way that gets to the court.
Yeah, and I also found it interesting that Oracle, they're in charge of the TikTok servers in America. They're allowing TikTok to run, whereas Apple and Google, they are complying with the law. They are taking a more risk-averse approach because they see the fines that could be levied on them, and they're saying, "Yeah, we're not going to participate in this. You cannot get TikTok from our app stores." So I'm sure we'll come back to that at a later date, but it is definitely an interesting situation that we're in.
And before we move to the next category, I just wanted to say one thing about sort of the messaging executive orders. Let's hope they remain messaging executive orders and nothing really drastic becomes of it. In normal times, if we pull out of the World Health Organization, all right, it's a problem, but it's not horrible. But if there's another pandemic, that is a problem, right? If we don't coordinate with the rest of the world and understand what's going on and are sitting here on our own saying, well, you know what? We don't need to be part of the World Health Organization. These things that are messaging can have real dire impacts, as can climate change down the road as well.
So I think the next category are the executive orders that seem good on their face, but if you start really digging into them, things can get scary pretty quickly. So, the first one is designating drug cartels as terrorist organizations. Well, yeah, drug cartels are bad. They do bad things. They are sometimes more violent than even ISIS, right? So is it that crazy?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, go ahead.
They're simply not terrorist organizations. Terrorist organizations use violence for political means. Drug cartels do not, and thus are not. Drug cartels are using violence to make money, right? So it's a bastardization of the whole process to say that they're terrorist organizations, because they're just simply not. Now, beyond that, right, let's say, okay, terrorist organizations. The real problem with naming a terrorist organization within a friendly country is it gives us sort of an incentive and almost an imperative to take some steps against them, right? Might we send special forces into Mexico to kill some cartels? Might we drop bombs on them like apparently Trump wanted to do in his first term? All these things would be fairly problematic if we did this to Mexico.
Yeah. So, I read the executive order and I there are some things that stood out to me. So he's asking the State Department and others to make recommendations in a 2-week time period. So that's unusual right there, right? That you only have 2 weeks. The government never works that fast. So to me, I was just like, okay, let's keep going. And then he's asking the Homeland Security Department and DOJ to prepare operations. And again, I was just like, that's weird. Typically, when you're dealing with terrorists, you have the National Security Council involved, you have the DOD involved. It's a foreign country, right? So you're not going to use DOJ for that. DHS, there are some small parts of DHS that are involved in international operations, but I found that very suspicious. And the reason I bring this up is that you shouldn't freak out just because you campaigned on it and he's ostensibly fulfilling a campaign promise, right? So I think what we should do is wait 2 weeks, see what the recommendation is, and then react. And I have a feeling that, no one's going to even remember this in 2 weeks. And it's just going to be on the Federal Registrar and nothing's going to come of it.
Well, I mean, I think I think you're right about whether or not we're going to go bomb these places in Mexico. But I think it's instructive to note that he's asking the DOJ and the DHS to do things. Because I'm guessing this is part of their broader border and immigration and deportation strategy, right? If we've got all these terrorist groups moving back and forth across the border, it's another justification for closing down the border. When it's a national security related thing, it's one that the courts have shown deference to in the past. They know this. They're probably counting on that going forward. But also, if you're naming all these cartels terrorist organizations, everyone who's involved with drug smuggling and drug dealing in the United States is at least tangentially connected to drug cartels and terrorist organizations. And DHS and the Justice Department would definitely be part of the response to that internally, right? Could be angling towards, again, reinforcing what they're trying to do with immigration, right? By declaring these people not only illegal immigrants, but terrorists, right? So make it, presumably, I'm going to guess it's a lot easier to deport people that you've decided are terrorists.
Right. And I think that's a good segue into the next executive order, was declaring a national emergency at the border and using the military for border enforcement. So this one actually has teeth, and we should definitely keep an eye out on this one.
Yeah, well, there are already soldiers on their way to the border,
right?
This is a real thing. This is happening. And this is, again, potentially at odds with established law, right? Using the military for certain things domestically is pretty much blatantly unconstitutional. So we'll have to see what happens with that. Again, it depends on who sues, who has standing, what's going on with that. I'm guessing Congress is not going to get in the way, right? So,
yeah, I mean, you can use the military for, like the National Guard is a good example, right? They are part of the military and they help with disaster relief. They can help, like the Army Corps of Engineers can help with certain things. But this is unusual because you actually have combat ready troops ready to do stuff. Now, yes. I think it's pretty clear right now, at least, that this is just showmanship, right? And a lot of the people within the military have said as much, under the condition of anonymity, of course. They say, yeah, this is just for the cameras and we're not going to do anything. But you know what? The use of emergency power should always give us pause. Mm-hmm. So while it's likely that this is just showmanship based on current reporting and what we know of the law, we should definitely keep an eye out on it.
Yeah, and one thing to remember too, in terms of what the military is allowed to do, participating in police enforcement is one thing they're not allowed to do.
Right. Big no-no.
It's the Posse Comitatus Act of whenever, a long time ago, right? It's sort of been law of the land for a long time. So if he starts using military units to enforce the border and arrest immigrants crossing the border, that's a problem, right? But again, who's going to get involved and what is the court going to do about this? Anybody's guess at this point in time. But as you said, we don't know yet. We should pay attention. We're going to talk a little bit more about how an approach to this later on. But this is the kind of thing is like, pay attention, see what happens next.
Yeah, the sky isn't falling yet, but just be aware.
Yep.
And then I think the last category of the reasonable ones that are messaging is designating the Houthis as a terrorist organization. You know what? I actually think this is something I support. That they were declared a terrorist organization a while ago, and then the Biden administration rescinded that order, but they never treated them as such post October 7th. And I found that interesting. So this seems to be fairly good. And the way you can tell it's a serious one is because in the executive order itself, they're invoking the Department of Treasury and the National Security Council. And you might say, well, what does the Treasury Department do? Well, they're the ones who are monitoring any sort of foreign transaction that goes to these organizations, and they will bring the hammer down using the economic might of America on anyone interacting with these organizations. And I want to contrast that with the drug cartel one, right? Because as you said before, there are a lot of organizations inside Mexico that inadvertently interact with the cartels or do so intentionally, right? And so the fact that the Treasury Department is not involved with the cartel executive order makes me think that they're not quite as serious. But again, as you said, we should keep an eye out on these things.
Yep. And so, yeah, when I think that the general approach you need to take is just that. That said, there are a number of executive orders that are just ridiculous, right? And there's a couple I think we wanted to talk about today. I know the first one that I think we should talk about just because it's the most absurd is ending birthright citizenship. Trump has said, you're no longer, if you're an illegal immigrant, you no longer become an automatic citizen if your parents give birth to you here. Also, it was interesting to note that he added a little caveat that would have made Kamala Harris not an American citizen, because people on student visas are not, their
Right.
children will not be American.
Any kind of visa.
Yeah, it's just like ridiculous. On its face, read the 14th Amendment. It's clear that if you're born here and subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, you're a citizen. And if you're wondering, well, what does that mean, subject to the jurisdiction? Clearly, you're an illegal immigrant. You're not subject to the jurisdiction. Well, if an illegal immigrant were to, say, shoot someone in the face, would they go to jail? Yes, they would. They're subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. They're not immune. The only people that have traditionally been ruled immune are, and not part of this, are diplomats. Right? A diplomat's child is not automatically a citizen.
Or literal invading force.
Yes. Well, and then, again, part of that is, I'm sure part of the rationale for Trump saying invasion all the time is because he wants to convince the court that this is an invading force. So you don't have to have their children be citizens. And this is the kind of executive order that you see and you're like, yeah, this administration doesn't care at all about the law, right? They care about making their political points, right? And it's a pretty good bet that this will be rejected every step of the way, as I'm certain Trump will appeal, right? It's already been given a preliminary injunction, I believe, in Washington State, where the first suit was, and it will almost certainly be upheld in the trial and by the appeals court out there, which tends to skew liberal. It'll be interesting what the Supreme Court does. Now, I think we both hope it's a 9-0 decision because it's pretty clear. I'm not going to bet the farm that it will be, but let's hope it is. Right? If it's not, if the Supreme Court does uphold this, we have a really big problem with the Supreme Court. Right? But I'm confident that they'll get rid of it. But I guess we'll have to see.
Yeah, I mean, the judge who gave the preliminary injunction said, "I've been on the bench for over 4 decades. I can't remember another case where the question presented is as clear as this one. This is a blatantly unconstitutional order." This is a Reagan-appointed judge. So this has no chance of surviving.
Let's hope.
And, the text of the executive order, it says, "No department or agency of the United States government shall issue documents recognizing United States citizenship or accept documents issued by state, local, or other governments or authorities purporting to recognize United States citizenship." So we know that Stephen Miller is listening to this podcast, right? Because, we mentioned the whole thing with Social Security cards, right?
Yes.
And, in theory, the Trump administration could just not give Social Security cards. And if that was the case, we are in a full-blown constitutional crisis, and we will have to cross that bridge when we get there.
Let's hope we do not. But it does raise a question, though, is why is he doing this? Because they know that it's going to be rejected by the court, and they're pretty confident that it's not going to pass the Supreme Court, right? But it's great signaling for the base, right? You're saying, see, we're trying, and then see, the swamp is holding us back. So it works on every level for them. If for whatever reason it got through, hey, that's a huge political win for them, at least with their base voters. And when it doesn't, they could keep going with the grievance machine. So there's no downside from their political perspective for doing this. And the moral considerations clearly aren't given a whole lot of weight.
Right. And so I think the last, I would put this in the batshit insane category, is this Schedule F civil servants executive order. Now, a lot of folks aren't going to be familiar with Schedule F. And we linked in the show notes some really good reporting by Jonathan Swan. At the time, he was at Axios. So definitely read them. They're really long articles, but they paint a much more detailed picture than what we're going to talk about in this segment here. But at the end of the day, what this is going to do is politicize the bureaucracy. Right now, we have several thousand political appointees by the president. So Secretary of Defense is a good example of that. Now, what Schedule F does is going to apply to roughly tens of thousands of employees, basically anyone who is remotely related to policy. So this could go all the way down to, say, some food scientist at the FDA who's trying to decide if, yellow 5 is dangerous to our health. That's a policy decision. And it's someone who is an expert. And what Schedule F is going to do is it's going to allow the president to get rid of those types of people and replace them with people who have a similar persuasion in terms of policy to the president.
Right. In a nutshell, it's going to open up tens of thousands of more jobs to political appointees, right? Whereas right now, ostensibly, I guess that's our word for the day. Since you used it earlier, I had to use it too. Ostensibly, our bureaucracy is designed to have experts staying out of politics, just executing their jobs. And the political people tell them what to do. They carry it out. That's what's supposed to happen. Trump complains that when the political people tell them what to do, last time the non-political people, maybe they dragged their feet a little bit and didn't do everything he wanted to do as quickly as he wanted it. So he thinks, let's get rid of more of these professional experts and we'll put in more people that are loyal to us, right? And we can debate whether in a perfect world, if you wanted to replace somebody whose policy agreed with you more, is that good or bad? I would argue no. I know you feel a little bit of a different position, but my whole thought is we have a bureaucracy that's supposed to stay out of politics, right? The people up top, they direct it. If the people down below don't do their jobs, then initiate a finding or something, action against them to get rid of them. But to get rid of people just because they're on the other team, right, is not going to make things any better for us. Especially when you think of the Trump administration and the GOP at large, really, their assault on expertise and elitism for the last however many years. They don't want to replace scientist A with scientist B, who just has a different conclusion. They want to replace scientist A with political flunky A, right? And they don't care if that will hurt the government. A good example would be right down the street from me is the National Atmospheric Research Center, right? I guarantee you a lot of those people are at the top of the list of people to get rid of because they do their jobs and they report on climate data, and the Republicans aren't interested in that. President Trump in particular is not interested in that. So we'll get people replacing all the scientists with people who are just more interested in preserving sort of the status quo for the energy companies.
Right. And I think you bring up a good point about, whether or not it's good policy in a vacuum. But we don't live in a vacuum.
We do not.
And realistically, this is just going to cause the country to go swing back and forth in wild directions. And for what reason, right? It's just to be loyal to one man.
Yeah, it would basically gut the expertise of the bureaucracy and make it a political pendulum. Every single time we have a change of policy or a change of president, we're going to get 10, 20,000 worth of people who are going to get fired and hired and whatever based on who's president. And certainly it doesn't encourage you to make a career out of being a civil servant if you know that if you get to where you'd like to be, you'll be fired every time the presidency changes.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Food scientists, environmental scientists, people who work at national parks who are monitoring animal populations. I mean, the list goes on.
Researchers.
Of course,
right?
Yeah.
All these things we need. It's useful for us to have very good people who have a lot of expertise and a lot of experience. And they just want to say, nope, done. We need political people in here instead.
Yeah. And you know what? We already had this system. It's called the spoil system. We tried it. It sucked. And we improved it, right? Why are we repeating history? Okay, so that wraps it up for us this week. As I said before, it's going to be a long 4 years. There's going to be a lot of the sky is falling. There's going to be a lot of this is complete bullshit. And we all just need to try our best to listen to Trump, take what he says seriously, but only react when it's appropriate to do so.
Yep. I think that's a really good lesson to wrap up with. And I think we'll probably spend some time here soon on talking about what the Democrats ought to do and how to react as a party. Because I think that's going to be a big challenge for them. And so far, I haven't been impressed with that. So I think we definitely need to they need to figure it out. And maybe we can comment on that as well.
Right. So anyways, make sure you like, subscribe, tell your friends, tell your grandma, you name it. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.